I was a graduate student in anthropology, studying the Native American folklore of the region. It was during a particularly grueling winter break that I stumbled upon an obscure manuscript written by a local anthropologist, Dr. Emma Taylor. The manuscript described an ancient legend passed down through generations of indigenous peoples, one that spoke of a terrifying entity known as the Wendigo. Key events. Dr. Taylor had spent years researching and documenting various accounts of the Wendigo, which was said to be born from human flesh consumed by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. According to legend, those who succumbed to the curse would undergo a grotesque transformation, their bodies twisting into unnatural forms as they became increasingly driven by cannibalistic urges. The manuscript also spoke of a whispering wind that seemed to precede the Wendigo's appearances, a chilling breeze that carried an otherworldly presence and sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. As I delved deeper into Dr. Taylor's work, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear a faint whispering in my ear, a soft susurration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the wind itself had taken on a voice. I tried to brush it off as mere paranoia, but the feeling persisted. My friends began to notice a change in me, too. I became withdrawn and isolated, spending every waking moment researching the Wendigo legend and poring over Dr. Taylor's manuscripts. They started to worry that I was losing my grip on reality. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something much bigger than myself, something that threatened to consume me whole. And so, with a sense of morbid fascination, I began to dig deeper into the heart of the Wendigo legend. I had spent countless nights researching Dr. Taylor's work, poring over her manuscripts and scouring the internet for any mention of the Wendigo legend. It was on one such night, while huddled in my cramped apartment, that I first heard the whispers. The wind outside seemed to be picking up, carrying with it an unearthly presence that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to focus on my notes, but the words blurred together as my mind began to wander. That was when I saw her, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of my window. Her eyes glowed like embers in the dark, and her skin was deathly pale. She didn't move or speak, just stood there watching me with an unblinking gaze. I froze, unable to breathe as she seemed to be absorbing every detail of my appearance. The wind howled louder, and the whispers grew louder still. It was then that I felt a presence behind me, a cold, clammy hand on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure at the window didn't blink or flinch either. She just kept watching me, her eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. The wind died down and the whispers ceased. I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window again, the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered, haunting me still. It was as if the Wendigo had left its mark on me, a subtle yet unmistakable signature that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I had been researching the Wendigo legend for weeks, poring over Dr. Taylor's manuscripts and scouring the internet for any mention of the entity. I was convinced that I had stumbled upon something big, something that could change the course of my career as an anthropologist. So, when I finally gathered enough evidence to convince myself that I was ready to take on the Wendigo, I set out to desecrate the land itself. I traveled to the remote wilderness where Dr. Taylor had first encountered the entity, armed with nothing but a backpack full of supplies and a fierce determination. The air was thick with an eerie silence as I trekked deeper into the forest, my senses on high alert for any sign of the Wendigo's presence. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches tangling together above my head like skeletal fingers. I felt like I was being herded towards some unknown fate, and the sense of foreboding only grew stronger with each step. And then I saw it, a clearing in the distance, surrounded by a ring of mushrooms that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The air around me began to vibrate with energy, and I could feel the weight of history bearing down upon me. This was it. This was where Dr. Taylor had first encountered the Wendigo, and now I was about to follow in her footsteps. I approached the clearing cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I entered the circle, the mushrooms seemed to part around me like a curtain, revealing a dark, swirling vortex at its center. It was as if I was being drawn into some ancient ritual, one that would unleash a power beyond anything I could comprehend. And then, I saw it, a figure standing in the heart of the vortex, its eyes blazing with an unholy intensity. The Wendigo had been waiting for me all along. I spent the next few days in the clearing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The Wendigo seemed to be waiting for me, its presence suffocating and oppressive. I knew that I needed to gather more information, to try and understand the true nature of this entity and its power. So, I set out to talk to the locals, to hear their stories and legends about the Wendigo. It wasn't easy. Many of them were hesitant to share their tales, fearing that they would be seen as superstitious or even witchcraft practicing. But I was determined, and eventually I managed to gather a handful of stories from various tribes in the area. They spoke of the Wendigo as a creature born from darkness and hunger, one that could only be satiated by consuming human flesh. Some said that it was an ancient spirit, one that had been awakened by some long-forgotten ritual. Others claimed that it was a manifestation of the forest itself, a physical embodiment of its darker energies. I listened to each tale with rapt attention, my mind racing with possibilities and implications. And then, there were the whispers, faint, flickering whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They spoke of an ancient pact, one between humans and the Wendigo itself. Some said that this pact had been forged in blood and sacrifice, while others claimed that it was a simple agreement, one that had been broken time and time again. I knew that I had stumbled upon something much bigger than myself, something that threatened to consume me whole. And so, with a sense of morbid fascination, I continued to gather more stories, driven by a desperate need to understand the true nature of this ancient entity. I had been traveling for days, trying to make sense of the stories I had gathered and the visions that haunted my dreams. The Wendigo's presence seemed to be growing stronger, its influence spreading like a stain across the land. I needed to find a place where I could lay low for a while, somewhere where I could gather my thoughts and try to understand what was happening. That's when I saw it, a small town nestled in the heart of the forest, its buildings seeming to lean in towards me like sentinels. The sign above the local diner read, "Welcome to Raven's Peak," and I knew that I had found what I was looking for. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the warm glow of the neon lights. The diner was empty, except for a single figure sitting at the counter, a man with piercing blue eyes and jet black hair, his face chiseled from granite. He looked like he hadn't smiled in years, and yet there was something about him that drew me in. "Can I get you something to eat?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I ordered a cup of coffee, feeling a sense of unease as my eyes met his. There was something about him that seemed off, like he was hiding secrets behind those piercing blue eyes, but I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the conversation. "I'm just passing through," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've been waiting for you," he he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this must be the only person in town who knew about the Wendigo. How did you know? I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. The man smiled, revealing perfectly straight teeth. I've been watching you for days, he said. You're not like the others. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that this stranger knew more about me than I knew myself. I sat across from the stranger at the diner, my eyes locked on his as he spoke. He told me that he had been a hunter for most of his life, tracking down creatures like the Wendigo that roamed the forest. But there was something different about this one, something that set it apart from the rest. It's been growing in power, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've seen it move mountains, make rivers run dry. I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke, my mind racing with possibilities. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The stranger leaned in closer, his eyes glinting with an otherworldly intensity. I want to show you the truth, he said. The truth about the Wendigo and about yourself. I felt a surge of fear as he spoke, but there was something in his words that drew me in. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice, or maybe it was the sense of discovery that hung in the air. Whatever it was, I knew that I had to hear him out. Let's go, I said finally, pushing my chair back and standing up. The stranger nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Follow me, he said, leading me out of the diner and into the darkness of the forest. We walked for what felt like hours, the trees seeming to close in around us like sentinels. I could feel the weight of the Wendigo's presence growing stronger with each step, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led deeper into its heart. Finally, we came to a clearing, and in the center of it stood an ancient tree, its branches reaching up towards the stars like skeletal fingers. The stranger nodded at the tree, his eyes glinting with a knowing light. This is where it begins, he said, and with that everything went black. I woke up to the sound of my own heartbeat, my mind foggy and disoriented. The stranger was standing over me, a look of concern etched on his face. You okay? He asked, his voice gentle. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over me, forcing me back onto the grassy clearing. The stranger helped me up, supporting my weight as we both gazed out at the ancient tree. Its branches seemed to be swaying in the breeze, but there was something unsettling about their movement. It was almost intentional. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The stranger's eyes met mine, and for a moment we just stared at each other. It was as if the world around us had melted away, leaving only the two of us. And then, without warning, everything snapped back into focus. The stranger's face blurred into a sea of faces, each one twisted in a different emotion. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of uncertainty. What's happening to me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's expression softened, and he reached out to place a hand on my shoulder. You're starting to remember, he said, his voice low and mysterious. The memories are coming back. I felt a surge of fear as I realized that the stranger was talking about something specific, something that I had tried to forget for years. But why? And what did it have to do with the Wendigo? Rituals and offerings. As I stood before the ancient tree, I could feel the weight of the stranger's words. Memories were coming back to me, but they were fragmented and unclear. The stranger seemed to sense my confusion and began to explain. Been chosen for a purpose, he said, his voice low and mysterious. A purpose that only you can fulfill. He led me deeper into the forest, to a clearing surrounded by a ring of stones. In the center of the clearing stood a small fire pit, surrounded by offerings of food, drink, and strange artifacts. This is where the rituals are performed, he said, his eyes glinting with an otherworldly intensity. Here, the The veil between worlds is at its thinnest. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that I was being drawn into something much larger than myself. The stranger began to prepare the offerings, his hands moving with a slow and deliberate precision. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The stranger turned to me, his eyes burning with an inner fire. "We're making an offering," he said. "An offering to the Wendigo to awaken it from its slumber." I felt a surge of fear as I realized what we were doing. But the stranger just smiled and handed me a small, delicate cup filled with a fragrant liquid. "Your turn," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. As I held the cup out to the fire, I felt a sense of trepidation. What was I getting myself into? But it was too late now. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. As the liquid from the cup sizzled and evaporated in the fire pit, I felt a strange energy building up inside me. The stranger's eyes seemed to gleam with an otherworldly light as he began to chant in a language that sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. The words were like a key turning in a lock, and suddenly the air around us seemed to vibrate with an electric tension. The fire pit erupted into a frenzy of flames and sparks, as if the very essence of the liquid had been unleashed. The stranger's eyes flashed with excitement as he raised his hands to the sky, and I felt myself being drawn into their vortex. I tried to resist, but it was too late. A wave of dark energy washed over me like a tide of madness. My vision blurred and shifted, and when my eyes cleared again, I saw that I was standing on two legs, my feet rooted firmly in the earth. The stranger's hands were still raised to the sky, and his voice had grown into a deafening roar. The air around us seemed to be tearing apart, like the fabric of reality itself. A great winged creature emerged from the darkness, its feathers rustling with a sound like dry leaves. Its eyes burned with an inner fire as it gazed upon me, and I felt my very soul being pulled towards them. The stranger's chant grew louder still, until it was almost a scream. The creature's wings beat the air with a rhythmic pounding, like a drum beat in the darkness. And then, in an instant, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the forest floor, my head throbbing with pain. The stranger was kneeling beside me, his eyes filled with concern. "What happened?" I groaned, my voice barely audible. The stranger's expression softened, and he reached out to help me sit up. "I think we've awakened it," he said, his voice low and serious. I looked around, trying to take in what was happening. The forest seemed to be shifting and twisting, like a living thing. And then I saw it. The creature that had been summoned by the ritual was standing before us, its eyes fixed upon me with an unblinking gaze. It was alive. As the creature loomed over me, its hot breath washing over my face, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The stranger's eyes seemed to gleam with an otherworldly light as he reached out and grasped my arm, pulling me to my feet. "We must go," he said, his voice low and urgent. But it was too late. The creature had already begun to move towards us, its massive strides devouring the distance between us. We ran, our feet pounding against the forest floor as we desperately sought to escape. But no matter how fast we ran, the creature was always just a step behind. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, its icy gaze fixed upon me like a death sentence. The stranger's arm was still wrapped around my waist, but I could sense his fear growing with every passing moment. We were running out of options, and I knew that we couldn't keep this up for much longer. Suddenly, the stranger stopped in his tracks, his head cocked to one side as he listened intently. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing but trees stretching out before us like a sea of green. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's eyes were fixed upon something in the distance, and for a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of hope. But then his face contorted in a look of horror. "It's coming," he whispered. And with that, the creature emerged from the trees, its eyes fixed upon us with an unblinking gaze. We were surrounded. The forest seemed to be closing in around us like a trap had been sprung. I knew then that we were doomed. The stranger's grip on my arm tightened, and I felt him pull me close as he prepared for the final confrontation. But it was too late. The creature loomed over us, its jaws open wide in a scream of rage. And in that moment, everything went black. I awoke to the sound of my own screams echoing through the forest. I was lying on the forest floor, my head throbbing with pain and my body battered and bruised. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, but his presence still lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to depart. As I struggled to sit up, I saw that I was alone. The creature had taken the stranger, its eyes fixed upon me with an unblinking gaze. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my legs felt like jelly and I collapsed back onto the earth. Panic set in as I realized that I was at the mercy of the Wendigo. It began to circle around me, its eyes burning with an otherworldly hunger. I knew then that I was its prey, doomed to be devoured by the monster that had been awakened by the ritual. The creature closed in, its jaws open wide in a scream of rage. I closed my eyes and waited for the end, but instead of pain, I felt something strange. A sense of calm washed over me, like a balm to my battered soul. It was as if the Wendigo had chosen me for some reason, and that it intended to spare my life. The creature loomed over me, its hot breath washing over my face, but instead of attacking, it reached out with a clawed hand and touched my forehead. I felt a surge of energy run through my body, like a spark of life had been ignited within me. And then, everything went black once more. I awoke to find myself in a place unlike any I had ever seen. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and the sky was a deep, burning crimson. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling from the sudden transition from the forest to this strange new realm. As I looked around, I saw that I was standing at the edge of a great precipice, with a churning sea of liquid fire stretching out before me. The creature stood beside me, its eyes fixed upon the void with an unblinking gaze. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature did not respond, but instead reached out and grasped my hand. It pulled me forward, and I felt myself being drawn towards the edge of the precipice. As we stood at the brink, I saw that the sea of liquid fire was not just a swirling vortex of flame, but a gateway to another realm. The creature leaned in close, its hot breath washing over my ear. "This is the threshold," it whispered. "Beyond this point, there is no turning back." And with that, it pushed me forward, and I felt myself being propelled across the churning sea of fire. I screamed as I was engulfed by the flames, but instead of pain, I felt a sense of liberation. I was leaving behind the world I knew and entering into a realm beyond my wildest imagination. As I emerged on the other side, I saw that I was standing in a vast, dark chamber filled with strange and wondrous sights. There were creatures unlike any I had ever seen, and artifacts that defied explanation. The creature stood beside me, its eyes fixed upon me with an unblinking gaze. "Welcome to the realm of the Wendigo," it said, its voice low and mysterious. "Here, you will find answers to your deepest questions, but also dangers beyond your wildest imagination."